Eyes on New Hampshire. Democrats are preparing for tomorrow's primary. We have a preview including which candidate is suddenly in the spotlight. Election year budget. The White House unveils a multi-trillion-dollar spending plan. We go inside the numbers. Hitting the road. Pope Francis announces the location of his first trip of 2020. We have a report from Rome. And the downside of technology, why Pope Francis is asking for help from internet companies. On EWTN News Nightly for Monday, February 10th, 2020. Good evening and thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Tracy Sable. President Donald Trump is heading to New Hampshire tonight to rally Republican support. Meanwhile, Democrats in the state are preparing for tomorrow's first in the nation primary. We're hearing from Democrats and the president ahead of tomorrow's crucial vote. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Mark?
Tracy, we spoke to a couple Democrats and have heard a lot from them lately about their support for abortion. President Trump says he's going to New Hampshire tonight to shake things up.
Thank you very much.
President Trump hosts an event today with governors at the White House before heading to New Hampshire for a campaign rally tonight where his supporters started lining up hours earlier. The president tweets, "We'll be in Manchester, New Hampshire tonight for a big rally. Want to shake up the Dems a little bit. They have a really boring deal going on." After claiming victory in Iowa, the spotlight is on former South Bend, Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg, who has been taking hits from the other Democrats.
Even if we can't agree on everything, we can absolutely agree that the time has come to turn the page on this president and on the situation that this country is in.
I am not the loudest person, but bit by bit, step by step, we have built this support for this nation.
Senator Amy Klobuchar is just one of the Democratic presidential candidates on the campaign trail in New Hampshire. She's behind in the polls, which show the frontrunner is Senator Bernie Sanders.
And the reason we did well in Iowa and the reason I believe we're going to do very, very well here in New Hampshire is because we have an unprecedented grassroots movement.
Sanders and the other leading Democrats all support abortion. He tweeted, "We have got to codify Roe v. Wade into law and significantly expand funding for Planned Parenthood." Klobuchar adds there is overwhelming public support to fund Planned Parenthood. We have to make sure women have access to contraceptives. And presidential candidate Senator Elizabeth Warren claims in a tweet, "Abortion rights are human rights. Abortion rights are economic rights." After Friday night's Democratic debate at St. Anselm College in Manchester, Andrew Yang told us he agrees with the other candidates, saying a president's Supreme Court nominees should support abortion.
I believe fundamentally in women's reproductive rights, and I think that any justice should have the same alignment.
Candidate Tom Steyer says his work on the issues, including climate change, separates him from the pack.
Look, if you look at climate, anybody can come up with a climate plan. I have 12 years of successfully achieving things in climate around the country, of getting clean energy passed, of beating oil companies when they think that they're unstoppable.
Whatever the results in New Hampshire tomorrow, it's clear the race is far from over.
There are 55 more states and territories after this. It looks like it is going to be a long battle to the nomination.
And the president is still upset about a couple of senators who voted against him in the Senate impeachment trial. Referring to Senators Joe Manchin and Mitt Romney, he tweets, quote, "They are really mad at Senator Joe Munchkin in West Virginia. He couldn't understand the transcripts. Romney could, but didn't want to." Tracy.
All right. Thank you, Mark. White House correspondent Mark Irons. Thanks again. The president's election year budget is out. The plan for fiscal year 2021 amounts to $4.8 trillion. The acting OMB director says the proposal does not allow taxpayer resources to go to clinics that perform abortions. It also includes greater funding for NASA, and it means an increase to the federal deficit. Catholic News Agency's Matt Hadra reports now from Capitol Hill.
Good evening, Tracy. Yes, the president's budget promises that the deficit will crest above $1 trillion for the current budget year, but will then begin decreasing to more manageable levels. Critics, however, say that the plan targets safety net programs for the poor. President Trump's fiscal year 2021 budget arrived to the Capitol by the boxful.
We have a tremendous $740 billion for military.
President Trump explains the military budget increase.
We're taking good care of our military. We're increasing spending on our nuclear program, because we have no choice, because of what China is doing, what Russia is doing in particular. And so we have a very big number in for that.
The plan appropriates $2 billion to border wall funding, allocates $1 trillion to the president's infrastructure proposal, and sets aside $130 billion to lower the costs of prescription drugs this year. Democratic leaders on Capitol Hill criticized the proposal. Minority Leader Chuck Schumer writes, "With his latest budget proposal, it's hard to imagine that President Trump could do any more to double-cross the very American workers and middle-class families he promised to help just last week in his State of the Union address." And Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi questioned the president's values, writing, "The budget is a statement of values, and once again, the president is showing just how little he values the good health, financial security, and well-being of hardworking American families."
During the 8 years of President Obama's presidency, he reduced the deficit by $1 trillion. Instead, this administration is increasing the $1 trillion.
But President Trump says, just wait.
So we're putting out a plan today that over a period of not that long a period of time brings our budget and our deficit down to what it should be, which is close to zero.
Democrats criticized the president for proposing tens of billions of dollars in Medicare cuts to hospitals. The president knows that his budget is not likely to ever become law, with Democrats in charge of the House and a bipartisan consensus necessary in the Senate to pass any spending bills. At the Capitol, Matt Hadro, EWTN News Nightly.
The deadliest mass shooting in Thailand's history and a gun battle with police that lasted more than 16 hours took place over the weekend. The gunman killed 29 people and wounded another 60 at a shopping mall in northern Thailand. And today, people have been laying flowers and paying tribute to the dead. Authorities say a 31-year-old Army sergeant went on a shooting spree after getting into a disagreement with his superior officer over a land dispute. For the last 2 nights, people have held Buddhist mourning ceremonies for the dead. The coronavirus has now killed more people than the SARS outbreak 18 years ago. Another 97 people died yesterday, making it the highest number of deaths in a single day. Chinese President Xi Jinping wore a face mask while visiting a hospital in Beijing. He had his temperature taken and spoke with doctors by video link. The outbreak is centered in the Hubei province, and today some factories there reopened for the first time since closing for an extended New Year's holiday. But other factories are still telling workers to stay home. A political bombshell in Ireland as the party associated with the IRA wins historic parliamentary elections. And while the leader says that she will work with other smaller parties, she's promising not to consider a coalition government with the traditional leading parties.
Our first preference is to form a new government without Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael. That will, of course, be very much dependent on the numbers. I've already made contact with the Greens, with the Social Democrats, with others. So that's the first option that I want us to explore.
The Sinn Féin party won 25% of the vote. This is the first time that the centrist parties have lost control since Ireland won independence from Britain a century ago. Bishops in Colombia wrap up their assembly meeting, putting forward their ideas to help Colombia solve some of the difficulties that the South American country is facing. The bishops presented 7 main points of focus at a press conference in Bogota. They include defending and respecting life, the need for social dialogue, and supporting peace. Colombia is dealing with a huge influx of migrants from neighboring Venezuela. Pope Francis is appealing to the international community to help the people of northern Syria, where an offensive by the Syrian army is causing a humanitarian catastrophe. The Holy Father's appeal to the world community was among his Sunday Angelus address. Today, Turkish soldiers are joining with the rebels in neighboring Syria. Russia is helping Syria in its bid to crush the last rebel stronghold in Idlib province. The rebels in Syria are getting help from Turkey and are armed with supplies from Turkey.
Perché è una vera piaga che sfrutta I più deboli.
Also Sunday, in his weekly address, Pope Francis urged internet companies to do more to fight human trafficking. The Holy Father called human trafficking a plague and said it exploits the weakest among us. Pope Francis also called for more healthy uses of modern technology. The Holy Father will visit the Mediterranean nation of Malta in May for the first papal trip of 2020. In September, the Holy Father met with Malta's President George Vela, where they discussed challenges facing migration. Pope Francis will visit the small Mediterranean island for a one-day visit on May 31st. It will be the first papal trip in Malta in 10 years. Hannah Brockhaus, senior Rome correspondent for Catholic News Agency, joins us now. Hannah, can you tell us why the Holy Father is visiting the Mediterranean island and what we can expect from his first 2020 papal trip?
Well, Tracy, I think as is well known, Pope Francis really has a heart for the plight of migrants and refugees. So it isn't too surprising that he would choose to visit the island of Malta and its smaller island, Gozo, nearby, which has really been a locus for the migrant and refugee crisis in recent years. It's also worth noting that the Archbishop of Malta, Charles Scicluna, is very well trusted by Pope Francis, very close to him, and has also been a key player in the Church's response to the sex abuse crisis.
Well, Malta's top two church leaders are very close to Pope Francis and have both echoed the Holy Father's concerns about the plight of migrants. How will the Holy Father's visit impact the island's political problems?
Well, on the topic of migration, Malta has received a lot of migrants and refugees to the nation, but last year they closed their ports to NGO ships which have rescued migrants in the Mediterranean Sea. So that has been an issue that has been on the part of the nation's conversation lately, as well as the fact of there has been some turmoil following the 2017 murder of a prominent investigative journalist in the country.
Hannah, can you explain why Malta is important in Christian history?
Well, in the Acts of the Apostles, there is a story about St. Paul, who actually shipwrecked off of the island of Malta together with about 270 other people, and they were miraculously all saved. And in the Acts of Apostles, chapter 28, it talks about their welcome to the island by the Maltese people. Pope Francis has been talking about that story recently in some of his public audiences, and he's been drawing a connection between the Maltese welcome of St. Paul and the others to the issue of welcoming migrants and refugees. So it is very fitting that he has chosen that theme for this trip.
Well, Hannah, thank you so much for your insight. Hannah Brockhaus, senior Rome correspondent for Catholic News Agency. Thank you once again.
Thank you.
Coming up, Senator Ben Sasse tells us about his push for a law to protect the unborn. Plus, an update on an attempt to enact a pro-life law in Kansas. Tomorrow, lawmakers on Capitol Hill are set to revisit a plan to require doctors to provide medical care to infants who survive an abortion. The Senate Judiciary Committee will hold hearings on the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act. The plan would require infants who survive an abortion be given the same care as any other newborn at that age. Lawmakers tried to pass the measure last year, but were unsuccessful. Joining us now is the bill's lead sponsor, Senator Ben Sasse, Republican from Nebraska. He has also backed a number of pro-life proposals on Capitol Hill. Senator Sasse, welcome back to our show.
Thank you, Tracy. Good to be with you.
Well, Senator, tell us specifically what's in the proposal and how it would protect abortion survivors.
You bet. So this legislation is just incredibly simple, and I think we should just start and say that, because people throw up a whole bunch of smoke and dust and nonsense and try to make it into something it's not. This bill says that a baby that survives a botched abortion should receive the same level of medical care that any other baby would get at that same gestational stage. There really shouldn't be anything controversial about this. This should already be the law of the land. This should be what the practice is in American life, and unfortunately it's not the current case, and so we should pass this law, and we ought to do it 100-0 in the United States Senate.
Well, as you mentioned, you're the lead sponsor of this bill. Tell us why this is so important to you.
Well, I think that there's a bunch about the pro-life movement, which is wonderful, and I've been blessed to be a part of this movement since I was a kid. And Lindsey Graham sponsors the pain-capable pro-life bill in the Senate, and I'm an original co-sponsor of that as well. But every place across the life debate, there are lots of people who pay a little bit of attention, and then there are some places where people pay a lot more attention. And when you think about the case of a baby that that survives a botched abortion, and we know from state level data that this happens in the procedure that's horrifically called backing away, where they take a baby that sometimes survives a botched abortion and they decide to not actively kill that little boy or that little girl by putting a pillow over the baby's face and snuffing its life out, but instead just backing away and letting it die by exposure. It's a horrific practice. Infanticide has obviously been a part of the evil histories of humanity going back for thousands of years, but it shouldn't be true among us. And yet that is one of the forms of death and killing that happens to babies that survive these botched abortions. And we ought to put an end to this horrific practice. And so this is one of the important places that we can love our neighbor and stand for life and talk about the dignity of everybody, including the most vulnerable, and that is those that have just been born and they need warmth and comfort and food and protection.
Well, Senator, the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act stalled last year. Can we talk a little bit about that, why it happened, and do you think it'll pass this time?
Thank you. So last year we were able to get a vote on this in the Senate about a year ago right now, or maybe 11 months ago. And a couple things to say that are good news before we get to the bad news of why it didn't ultimately become law. Good news, it got a majority of the Senate's votes. It was a bipartisan vote. And we had a president who was willing to and waiting to sign it. So that's all good stuff. The bad news is, as you well know, to pass something in the U.S. Senate doesn't just require a majority vote. It requires a 3/5 vote to end the debate and get to the place where we can finally take the final vote on passage. And we had enough Democrats who were willing to filibuster the bill that we didn't get to 60 votes. And that was after the disgraced governor of Virginia, Governor Ralph Northam, had made just these horribly debauched comments about whether or not a doctor and a baby's mother could let a baby sort of be kept comfortable while there was a decision made about whether or not to kill this baby. Just bizarre and horrific stuff. There was similar action that had moved in the New York state legislature, and so there was some public attention on the issue at that point, and we were able to get the bill to the floor of the Senate and again get a bipartisan vote and get a majority vote, and we had a president waiting to sign, but we couldn't get the bill ultimately passed because the Democrats decided to filibuster it. I hope that doesn't happen again. This should be, as we mentioned before, 100-0 vote. Again, I'm a very pro-life guy, but even people who don't agree with me on abortion and life issues ought to be able to agree that a baby that has already been born, a baby that's already survived an abortion attempt, deserves care, deserves protection, deserves warmth and comfort.
Well, Senator, quickly, I'd like to ask you, as we're going to switch gears a little bit. Last month, President Trump became the first sitting president to address the March for Life. Tell us what that meant to you personally and also what you think it means for the pro-life movement.
Yeah, I'm so glad that the president went out and spoke at the march. I had the opportunity to welcome a lot of the Nebraskans to town who were here in D.C. to be a part of the march. And a couple weeks before, we'd done the Walk for Life, as we do in Lincoln around the unicameral every year. And one of the things that people who are regularly a part of the march and different walks for life that happen in 50 state capitals around the country know is that the vast majority of the pro-life movement isn't really primarily about legislation. Obviously, we're talking about legislation here today, Tracy. Legislation matters, but more fundamentally, the pro-life movement is about love of neighbor. The pro-life movement is about trying to win hearts and minds. We want to change laws, but what we primarily want to do is win hearts and minds. And seeing President Trump come out and address the March for Life was a really big moment in the last 4 decades and change of this movement. And I hope it becomes a thing that presidents future all feel a burden to be at, this unbelievable outpouring of love and care and affection and concern for our neighbors, and especially the weakest and most vulnerable among us. So I applaud the president for having shown up and given a powerful speech.
Well, Senator, thank you so much. Senator Ben Sasse, Republican from Nebraska, thanks again for your time.
Thanks, Tracy.
All Republican state senators in Kansas failed to pass a pro-life amendment to the state constitution, but they are still hoping to get the measure on a statewide ballot. Pro-life senators are trying to overturn a decision by the Supreme Court in Kansas that made abortion a fundamental right. They want the issue to be decided by voters. If the measure is approved for a statewide election, then just a simple majority of the people of Kansas would be enough to change the state's constitution. Up next, an initiative to tell the faithful about the gift of marriage. Tonight is National Marriage Week. The initiative is sponsored by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. It seeks to proclaim the beauty and the goodness of marriage while also letting couples know what resources are available to them. Joining us now to discuss National Marriage Week is Dominic Lombardi. He is Executive Director of the USCCB's Secretariat of Laity, Marriage, Family Life, and Youth. Dominic, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here, Tracy. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. Well, Dominic, according to the Pew Research Center, Americans are staying single longer. I think the average age for men is about 30 to get married, 28 for women. What would you tell people who decide to wait, a little later in life to get married?
I think that actually something that needs to precede is a spiritual life and discernment. And so what guides our decisions is our relationship with the Lord. And so whenever we meet that person or that person meets us, that relationship is founded upon that relationship with the Lord, and the Lord will guide us to the time in which He's calling us to the sacrament. But in a culture in which autonomy is emphasized, where people come from a family in which divorce has been experienced, people do not feel confident or secure. And so part of this marrying later in life is an inability to make a commitment. And we really have to go to the origin of why people are having that difficulty, and that origin is the relationship with God.
And are there resources that are available to couples who maybe are going through this?
Sure. I think that we do have the website foryourmarriage.org, which has a wide array of resources, but also the witnesses of Catholic couples about their faith, about their struggles, about how the Lord has entered into their lives and brought them to a fruitful and wonderful marriage. So that would be a great place to go for information.
Great. What have couples said, or have couples said anything to you or anyone else in the organization about how those resources may have helped them?
I think especially where they find the witness of other couples who have had the same struggles as they have, and they can see how they've dealt with those issues and how they've grown and matured in life, and how the Lord has healed them and brought them to fruitfulness.
Great. Switching gears a little bit, earlier this year, the church officials in Spain unveiled a course for couples that were looking to get married. And it's about a 2 to 3 year course with the idea of lowering the divorce rates and getting people to hang in there and stay married. Do you think that this is something that the USCCB would consider?
Well, I know that in dioceses, there is a requirement, and it varies in time from a year to perhaps 6 months before marriage, that there's a requirement for marriage preparation. We know statistically, even from secular contexts, that any form of marriage preparation, 6 weeks or so, leads to lower divorce rates. So the fact that the Catholic Church requires 9 months to a year in many dioceses is a great aid to society. It really depends upon the couple, though, in many respects, so that 2 to 3 years, it may be the case for many couples today who come with that uncertainty in their lives, this period of what we would call like a catechumenate. But there's also something significant in that there's a kind of choice that we make to God, that we don't know all the things that we're going to encounter in married life. And that the church accompanies couples in marriages throughout their lives. And so the key is that it's not just preparing for the wedding day, it's beyond the wedding day, and for the whole of life. The couples need to be close to the church, and the church needs to be close to them.
Well, Dominic, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your insight. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you, Tracy.
Dominic Lombardi, Executive Director of the USCCB's Secretariat of Laity, Marriage, Family Life, and Youth. Thanks again, Dominic.
Thank you.
Pope Francis praised the Knights of Columbus, the world's largest Catholic fraternal organization, for their charitable work and devotion to St. Peter. The Holy Father thanked the Knights for their work in establishing sports centers for the youth. Those centers have turned into places for education, catechesis, and help for those in need. Pope Francis also thanked the group for their unswerving devotion to the successor of Peter, adding that they are an inspiration to overcome indifference and together build a more inclusive society. This comes as the Knights celebrate 100 years of their presence in Rome. The Knights of Columbus also sponsor our news broadcast. Thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Tracy Sable. We're back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night and God bless.